Coming to you live around the world from NOV's Studio 202. This is Inside Out Horizons. With your hosts, Lydia Mabry, Jeremy Grzywa, Cass Casey, and Shelby Dumaine. Now, let's start the show.
Welcome to Inside Out Horizons. On this show, we discuss the future of the energy industry, and we talk to subject matter experts to get their opinions on where we're heading in the future. So today, I'd like to welcome Assaad Mohanna, Senior Director of Low Carbon Solutions at NOV, and Kamalpreet Kaur, who is the business analyst for the Low Carbon Solutions Group. My name is Jeremy Grzywa. I'm your host today. So let's get it kicked off. Assaad, can you give us a high-level overview of the Low Carbon Solutions team for NOV?
Yeah, absolutely. Jeremy, thank you for having us on the show today. It's a pleasure to be back. I think it's very timely to have a conversation about low carbon solutions just because it's been front and center. And the focus of many companies, many countries and governments, and really at the very center of the transition. And so for us, we've started this transition a few years ago. We formalized our group in the last couple of years. And we sit in a place where we support the commercialization of new technology, the identification of new areas where we find our organization, our company needs to be a part of, and really supporting the business units in carving out a space in technology, in strategy, in business development to advance the conversation in low carbon technologies.
Great, that's great. And Kamal, you're a business analyst, so you're constantly looking at all these technologies that are emerging, looking at what's happening in universities, what's happening in organizations. What direction do you see this going for oil and gas companies?
Well, I do. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. Thank you so much, Jeremy. By title, I am a business analyst, and that means I'm looking at a lot of data, a lot of where the market is going, where technologies are going, and it seems to be in a very positive light when it comes to technology. There's a lot of advancement, a lot of technology readiness when it comes to the capture technology, if we only talk about carbon, as well as many other forms of technology for hydrogen geothermal. And when it comes to universities and other organizations, a lot that I see is a lot of creativity, a lot of new ideas that coming in the forefront that are really taking this energy transition to the next level. And as an oil and gas company or an energy company, what we would like to call ourselves, we are really well positioned to be here in this transition and moving forward with our intelligence on energy, as well as our workforce, as well as the talent that we have hired. And the talent that is coming into our industry. So I think as a company, as an industry, we're really well positioned, and it's really good timing too.
Well, that's fantastic. I think it's going to be a great conversation today. For you viewers online, we are live, so if you have questions, if you want to participate in today's show, I'll kick it over to Christian, and he'll tell you how you can get involved.
Appreciate it, Justin. Yeah, if you guys have any questions for our panel here today, be sure to drop those questions in the comments, and we'll try to get to as many of them by the end of the show as we can. And I'm sure they'll have some real insightful answers. Thanks, Justin.
Okay, thank you. So, Assaad, let's start with the state of technology. How do you view the technology in terms of, making short-term gains versus keeping an eye on, long-term future, 10, 20 years? What needs to happen for the industry?
I think there are a few challenges for us, and technology is definitely one of them in energy transition. And you're right, there's a short-term and a long-term probably prospect for each. There's no doubt that if we want to get to the 2040 goals in time, we're going to have to accelerate things. And from what we see is that the majority of technology needed for those goals to happen still sitting in the labs, which is not a great situation. But I think, and I truly believe in using what we have. A lot of that technology today is available. And so if we're able to use existing infrastructure, existing capabilities, add that on to digitalization, and additional capabilities, I think we're able to accelerate the progression and readiness. Now, the conversation has evolved tremendously. We were sitting here last year or 2 years ago, and the conversation was entirely different. We were still figuring out where we want to be, what do we want to do. I think we're today at the point where we know who we want to become. And we've built a roadmap of what are our capabilities and strength we want to have in these spaces, whether it's carbon capture or hydrogen or geothermal or others. And where do we fit in? And so the business models are starting to become clearer. The needs that we are required to build organizations and businesses around these verticals are also becoming clearer. And I think most importantly, the adoption by the organizations, by the business leaders, and saying, yes, there is an opportunity here and we need to invest in it. Although the payoff might be longer term, but there's things to be done today. There's a market that exists, and while it's still growing, there's a lot of room to establish ourselves, or for any organization to establish itself as a key player in this space. And I think because it's growing, it's appealing, it's critical to bringing those capabilities that we have today and repurpose them to serve the low carbon solutions space.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be an openness for collaboration in this space, more so than probably the traditional oil and gas verticals. Companies coming together to talk about, how do they define a business model? How do they work together to create a solution or address a challenge? So, Kamal, in some of the research you've done, what kind of organizations are emerging, or where are you seeing traditional oil and gas companies pop up, maybe next to startups or universities, other players who are looking to make an impact?
The two that we're really involved in is the Global CCS Institute as well as the Carbon Coalition for carbon capture. And there are two organizations quite different from each other, but have the similar model of bringing in a lot of different players together. I recently attended an event in the beginning of this year, which was a completely women's only that were involved in carbon capture. And the sheer number of women that were representing different companies that were there, it was it was really pleasant to see. You see that in your SPEs or IADC that are representing oil and gas. But to see that kind of transition into the carbon capture world and see that into the low carbon solutions world, it's pretty amazing to see that change. And with these organizations, you have a lot of universities that are involved with them, as well as startups. So it's a collaboration. It's an ecosystem that's building. Yeah.
I think it's a great point you bring up with women getting involved in this emerging market. It's such a hot topic for the industry of sustainability, and sustainability really as the meeting point between energy transition topics and emissions management, and then corporate governance and initiatives around inclusion and diversity. So I think it's cool to see those two topics kind of trending in parallel to each other and getting a real focus in today's market.
Yeah.
So. It truly is. I think oil and gas industry is not the best in having the diversity. But I think with the energy transition, sustainability space, we get to do things right and get that mix. And I think it's happening. I think that diversity that Kamal's talking about and getting more females into that space, I think balances out where we've missed out in oil and gas.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let's get a little bit deeper into some of the technology. So what can you tell us about what NOV is doing? Let's start in the carbon capture space.
Yeah, so look, let me track back a little bit. A few years ago, we had an initiative to get the organization together at the leadership level and say, what is it that we want to be a part of? And we've started with 20 different verticals, starting from solar and wind, ending with aquaculture and offshore PV and anything in between. And at some point, we strategized and said, we want to be in these particular spaces, but we don't want to be in these others, just because we can add value in those. And so we ended up with 8 or 9 verticals out of those 20, which range from offshore wind and onshore wind and solar, but also carbon capture, geothermal, hydrogen, biogas, and a couple others. And we've decided that these are perhaps the areas that are worth us spending the most time on. And as doing so, we've identified 2 probably the most close to commercialization areas, which were offshore wind, which we are a big player in today, in building wind tower installation vessels. Majority of the world's installed base is touched by a NOV designed and kitted vessel, but also in the floating wind with the foundations of the floaters. And so offshore wind was a big space, and it is today a very good business for NOV. But also carbon capture identified itself as a space where we have done and accumulated experience and expertise over the years that overlaps and overlays quite a bit of the requirements to have a sustainable and solid differentiated carbon capture business. And that's because we've been in the gas sweetening, gas dehydration, H2S separation space. So a lot of gas conditioning expertise, which really combines the process engineering capabilities on top of the chemistry capabilities. And so bringing those together, our way into the market was natural. And so today we're involved in multiple partnerships and relationships and projects that get us into the dehydration that we do for CO2 that's very similar to dehydration in natural gas processing around the world. 400 projects around the world translates very well into the CO2 dehydration and separation space. And so on the capture side, that made NOV a natural entrant and player, making us have very advanced conversation in that space today as it evolves and it grows. On the transportation of CO2, we've built over 1,000 kilometers of CO2 pipeline, non-metallic pipeline, but also been involved in the coating of the steel pipeline in Petronova, a very landmark project in CO2 capture. And so in the midstream aspect of CCUS, we're also very strongly there. And then the last vertical within CCUS, I would say in the storage or the sequestration, we've also been involved in, we're an oil and gas well drilling company historically, and we've been in well construction for many, many years. And so bringing the expertise in especially designing these wells to adapt for CO2, but also introducing new technology through partnerships, and you mentioned universities and startups, to complement what we do not have, whether it's monitoring the CO2 plume or others. I think that for us, looking at CCUS as an entire value chain, because you cannot separate each from the other. Very importantly, CCUS is a tough business. And so for us, it's technology, but also it's economics. And how do we find the sweet spot where CCUS today, under $50 a ton, actually make financial sense? In the sense, you can capture extremely high concentration CO2 from the ethanol plants, and then sequester underground in a very nearby facility. That gets you in the positive. So realizing those niche areas is very critical. Moving on from CCUS, I would say geothermal is a natural one for us, because we've been in the hot well drilling space. And so getting into that, plus making some investments to reduce costs of drilling a well through reducing the times it takes to drill in and out, or the drill bit life. And then beyond that, I would say there's areas like emission monitoring, which is pretty high on the list. Biogas, which we've been in for years. It feels like I'm missing a couple. But definitely a high focus on What is it that we do today, and how can we advance and get into these spaces?
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit more about emissions monitoring. Where is that taking place? Are we talking onshore, offshore, both? Why is that an important topic?
Yeah, so I would probably break that down into two. So when we talk about CCUS in the first place, we are, so there is an offshore aspect to that. And that's, for a lot of what's happening in Europe, a lot of what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. It's not so much emission monitoring, it's as much as it is storage as it is today. But I would also mention offshore capture rather than just storage. Capture from existing production facilities, from FPSOs. And I think that plays a big role in decarbonization of oil and gas. And the initiative we've taken is a joint industry project to bring in major players in offshore oil and gas to identify what technology can we deploy to capture carbon offshore and what to do with that CO2 once it's captured. And with that sort of GIP vehicle that we've created moving faster than a typical GIP, having the right players to execute in a faster manner. And so that's ongoing. And I think the flip side to your question as well is on the emission monitoring. And I think for us, perhaps another one of those extremely high, critical, important strategic areas where we feel a lot of the expertise we bring into the table already exists. And so I think bringing those capabilities that we have in-house, deploying the capabilities that we have on the ground, our MD Totco business, renowned for the capabilities it has on the boots on the ground, the sensor deployment in the oil field, as well as digital platforms that we have. Our Max digital platform, which is almost agnostic to the input of data, but can deploy it to wherever you are. That sort of digital and automation capabilities, topped with the service capabilities that we have on the ground, are a good recipe to have a solid business in this space.
It seems like a good instrumentation monitoring meets cloud ecosystem that seemingly pretty adaptable depending on what type of installations are looking for that kind of service.
Yeah,
seems like it has a broad fit.
And in some of these places, technology is no longer the problem. It's deployment, it's scalability, and it's just making the economics work.
Almost breaking down that risk across the the value chain for any given business vertical.
That's right. That's right.
Let's kick it over to Christian, see if we have any questions coming in from the viewers online.
Yeah. One question was, are there any examples of partnerships in the low carbon space that have really stuck out to you?
Anyone want to take this one?
Yeah, look, I think as an organization, we've defined partnerships in multiple ways. We've, identified gaps we've had in the company, and we've filled them with either universities that have made headway in developing technology, perhaps on paper sometimes, or lab scale, that we've brought in and scaled up. We speak to the government a lot more often than we did, meaning the Department of Energy and all that it's got to help accelerate technology that doesn't necessarily make economic sense today. We've made investments in smaller and larger companies that made sense to kind of latch on as a business. And I'll say something. I mean, this is not new for us. Gusto MSC is probably the greatest example of how we got into offshore wind, an investment that perhaps was looked at as an offshore platform or structured design company that turned into an offshore wind installation vessel company. So we're very open to building relationships and speaking to, I mean, Kamal mentioned GCCI and some others. And I think that open-mindedness is key. There's no longer a value chain in low carbon solutions, or there's everybody sitting at the same table, to your point, Jeremy, assessing the risks involved, because if not everybody is giving their thumbs up or sharing the risk, the project's not going to go too far.
Yeah, and not only, like, I know the question was more about external partnerships, but I think a really big part of a company, especially like us transitioning into energy transition, is making those internal connections and internal partnership with different organizations inside the company. And I've seen this as I've talked to other people with different companies, how they have come together and really have those forms of networks inside their company. So it's not only external partnerships, but as well as internally how the organization changes and the partnerships that you make in order to fill those gaps as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think an example that came to mind for me, I was touring the National Renewable Energy Laboratory just outside of Denver, and the amount of companies represented on the walls as you're walking through who are working with the Department of Energy to commercialize and scale the technologies that they're researching. There's a lot of familiar names from the oil and gas industry there, as well as new emerging players in the field. So yeah, I think that's everything seems to be trending in the right direction from a carbon management standpoint.
And that does remind me of the two incubators that we really work with, ION and the Greentown Labs, that have a lot of energy companies that are on the wall. That just reminded me of that. But the internal, I guess not only startups, but as well as big companies, major companies that are also coming in those partnerships as well.
That's great. Christian, do we have any more questions from viewers?
Yeah, we got another one real quick. Do you think alternative fuels like hydrogen, for example, will replace fossil fuels? And if so, how would that work?
I can take a stab at this one. I think what you'll see, at least initially, is a blending of hydrogen into existing infrastructure. There's already pilot projects talking about using hydrogen for building heat, blending into existing natural gas pipelines. A lot of talk about ammonia in this space as an energy carrier. And so will it completely replace fossil fuels as an energy source in the future? I think the jury's still out on that, but there's a lot of potential there. And I think what it's going to come down to is what is the national policy and what are the goals of a country or a region and how they're going to address their own, carbon emissions goals. So hydrogen is certainly out there as a potential solution. There's a lot of other solutions as well.
I want to bring up a recent study that was done by a big major oil and gas company, and it's modeling what if every vehicle in the world converted to becoming an electric vehicle by 2030, what would happen to oil and gas consumption? And the answer was, if that were to become true, if all of a sudden we see every individual around the world driving an EV, then demand for oil and gas would return back to the levels it was in 2013, which was a very healthy level. And it's, remember, oil and gas not only used for land transportation, but it's also used in many, many other disciplines and present in almost everything we're surrounded in today. And so for that transition to happen, imagine as big an impact as EVs replacing internal combustion vehicles today will only bring back demand to 2013. So it's a long way for any alternative type of energy source to replace oil and gas.
Yeah, I think it's important also to mention how closely energy is tied to the standard of living in most countries. And, you have a lot of emerging economies where demand for energy is a priority and the lowest cost energy usually wins out.
Yeah.
So for the challenge for our industry and for all the companies who are out there looking to address climate change issues is how do we bring the cost down to where even an emerging economy chooses a lower carbon form of energy, because honestly, it's not fair to ask some of these emerging economies and to sacrifice their access to energy in the name of climate change, and it's probably an unrealistic expectation
Yep.
to hold them to.
At a high cost, yeah. And I would add to that, quickly the conversation around ESG, the E in ESG is shifting to becoming energy security rather than just environment. And so if you're not able to sustain and be independent from wars like we're seeing in Europe today, or from natural disasters, or from disease outbreaks, then you're at a disadvantage, and you want to make sure that that's not going to be a risk on your energy supply.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, yeah, sure. Right now, a bit of a hot topic with gas prices. Is there any relationship between carbon capture technologies and fuel prices in general?
I think the answer is probably yes, but a distant yes. The relationship there has to be some kind of correlation. Remember, when we're doing carbon capture, that's really coming at the cost of the output of that plant emitting CO2. So think of a natural gas power plant it's burning natural gas and that's emitting CO2 into the air at somewhere between 4 and 8% concentration CO2. And you say, I want to capture that carbon coming out of that facility. And what you do is build a several $million facility sitting next to it that's almost equal the size of that existing natural gas power plant. And you're going to ask that facility to generate energy for the chemical that's sitting in it to latch onto the CO2 coming from that natural gas facility, and then break it down through a lot of heat to release that CO2 from that chemical that you've introduced. That's consuming energy that you would otherwise have used either to power homes or to power that facility that's generating energy. And so when you're reducing that parasitic consumption of energy from your original generator of energy is growing, that means the cost of your output is increasing, because on a per unit cost, you're required to deliver a greater amount of energy. And so at the end of the day, who's paying the cost of that energy is the end user. And the end user is going to pay for that increment of per unit cost that's resulting from that added on carbon capture facility. So the answer is yes. The more you add complication and equipment and capabilities to that facility, the greater is going to be the price of that output energy. And I think we're starting to see that, not because we're adding carbon capture facilities to plants, but because we're seeing that reduction in supply, which really has a similar impact. So I think the answer is in advancing technology and getting creative in business models and finding ways to fill those gaps so that when we're doing today $60 or $70 per ton of CO2 captured, we can get to $20 and $30 per ton captured so that the increment cost increase is minimized.
And yeah, and you see a lot of, depending on the country, you see a lot of policies that are trying to help, move things forward a little bit faster. So here in the U.S., we subsidize carbon capture, and we subsidize it differently if it's going to be stored permanently versus used for enhanced oil recovery. And in Europe, you see taxes to companies who are emitting. So I think that plays a role in that conversation as well.
Yep.
It's a very tangled web, so to speak. So it'd be hard to make a direct correlation to the prices at a gas pump.
Yeah.
No, I agree. it's a correlation, but a really far-fetched correlation. I think Assaad did a really good job of kind of putting it together. But one thing I do want to mention also is that a lot of the time people kind of confuse in carbon capture versus low carbon solutions and then the energy transition. All three of them are very different things. So when it comes to the energy transition, carbon capture, you capture the carbon that's coming out. But in order for us to have an energy transition, we need multiple sources that are replacing what our fuel is. And all of that needs to go in a tangent to achieve those goals that are for 1.5 degrees Celsius that are set for 2050 or 2040. So I think all of the things coming in together, and we do this little internal kind of a training inside of our company and go through what low carbon solutions is. And one slide that I really do think about is the energy mix and how it has increased from the 1500s to versus now, and how it's getting more and more colorful as we're adding more and more sources of energy coming in. So eventually, fuel prices, yeah, it will be directly correlated, but we'll have fuel coming in from so many different sources. And that's the best case scenario for the future. So
Thanks, Kamal.
it's a positive change.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of today's show. Want to thank our guests for joining us today, sharing your opinions, giving us some insights onto how NOV is thinking about this issue. For those of you online, you can see a recorded version of today's discussion on nov.com/live, and you can also view a lot of past content there with similar topics that go into more detail with subject matter experts from all over the industry. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.